The mountain air hung thin and cold at Forward Operating Base Blackwood, nestled in the Kunar province of eastern Afghanistan, where jagged peaks scraped against an impossibly blue sky. September 2019 had arrived with the kind of deceptive calm that experienced soldiers learned never to trust. Specialist Cassandra Brennan stood outside the aid station, her hands wrapped around a dented metal cup of coffee that had gone cold 30 minutes ago. She didn't drink it. The ritual of holding something warm had become more important than the caffeine itself during her 14 months in country. At 28 years old, Cass carried herself with the quiet confidence of a combat medic who had seen enough blood to fill a swimming pool and enough trauma to break most people twice over. Her grandfather's words echoed in her mind on mornings like this, words her father had repeated so often, they felt like scripture. A medic's hands are the last thing dying soldiers feel. Make sure they feel hope, not fear. Colonel William Brennan had saved 47 men during the Normandy invasion in 1944, working under fire on beaches where the surf ran red with American blood. He had carried wounded soldiers through machine gun nests and artillery barrages, refusing to leave anyone behind. The Distinguished Service Cross he earned sat in a display case in Detroit, gathering dust alongside his Bronze Star and Purple Heart. Cass's father, Sergeant Robert Brennan, had followed that legacy into Desert Storm in 1991, serving as a combat medic with the 3rd Armored Division during the ground assault into Iraq. He had treated casualties in burning Bradley fighting vehicles and stabilized wounded soldiers in sandstorms that turned day into apocalyptic darkness. His Bronze Star for Valor sat beside his father's medals, a family tradition built on blood and sacrifice, and the absolute refusal to let soldiers die alone. Now Cass carried that tradition forward on her own shoulders, lighter than her grandfather's burden, heavier than she had ever imagined when she enlisted at 22. She had joined the Army for the same reason her father and grandfather had worn the uniform, not because she was running from something, but because she was running toward purpose. Some people spent their lives searching for meaning. Cass had found it in the simple act of keeping other people alive when everything was trying to kill them. Fort Sam Houston's 68W combat medic training had stripped away any romantic notions about military medicine. The instructors pushed trainees through emergency procedures that most civilian paramedics never encountered in entire careers. Cass learned to insert chest tubes while wearing full body armor and gas masks. She practiced tourniquet application until her hands moved faster than conscious thought. She memorized drug dosages and treatment protocols, carrying the weight of knowing that her skills might determine whether soldiers went home to their families or went home in flag-draped transfer cases. 6 years had passed since that training. 2 deployments to Afghanistan had transformed textbook knowledge into muscle memory written in adrenaline and blood. Cass had treated gunshot wounds and IED blast injuries. She had performed emergency cricothyrotomies with pocket knives when airways collapsed. She had held dying soldiers while they whispered final messages for families they would never see again. The aid station at Forward Operating Base Blackwood served approximately 200 personnel, a mix of Army infantry, Special Forces, intelligence analysts, and support staff. The base occupied strategic high ground along known Taliban infiltration routes, which meant regular contact with the enemy forces who had been fighting in these mountains since before Cass was born. She worked alongside Captain Marcus Holloway, the battalion surgeon, a 45-year-old trauma specialist who had abandoned a lucrative civilian practice to serve in uniform. Holloway possessed the steady hands and calm demeanor of someone who had performed thousands of surgeries in both sterile operating rooms and dusty forward aid stations. He carried the burden of command alongside his medical expertise, responsible not just for treating patients, but for training and leading the medics under his care. Corporal James Sullivan was the other combat medic assigned to their station, a 33-year-old career soldier on his 4th deployment. Doc Sullivan, as everyone called him, had seen more combat than most infantry soldiers treating casualties in Helmand Province, Kandahar, and now Kunar. He had taught Cass practical skills that no training could replicate, lessons learned through hard experience about how to function when everything went wrong simultaneously. Together, they treated everything from routine sick call complaints to combat casualties that arrived bleeding and screaming on stretchers carried by soldiers with wild eyes and shaking hands. They set broken bones and diagnosed infections. They administered antibiotics and performed minor surgeries. They stood as the thin medical line between wounded warriors and death itself. The morning sun climbed higher, burning away the last wisps of fog that clung to the valley below. Cass finished her cold coffee and turned to head back inside when she noticed the Chinook helicopter descending toward the landing zone, its twin rotors beating the air into submission. Unscheduled arrivals always meant something significant. Medical evacuations came in Blackhawks. Supply runs followed predictable schedules. A Chinook landing mid-morning on a Tuesday carried the weight of importance. The helicopter touched down in a cloud of dust and debris. Cass watched as a figure emerged from the back ramp, moving with the careful deliberation of someone whose body had accumulated decades of hard use. Even from a distance, she recognized military bearing in the way he carried himself, despite civilian clothes, in a weathered canvas duffel bag slung over one shoulder. Captain Holloway emerged from the aid station beside her, squinting against the morning glare. "That's Sergeant Major Garrison. He's here for his final tour before retirement." Cass turned to look at her commanding officer. "A sergeant major here. We're not exactly high profile." Holloway smiled slightly, the expression carrying knowledge of things not yet shared. "Nathaniel Garrison isn't just any sergeant major. He's a legend. 42 years of service. Special Forces medic since before you were born. Somalia, Bosnia, both Iraq wars, multiple Afghanistan rotations. The man has more combat experience than our entire battalion combined." The figure approached across the compound, and Cass got her first clear look at Sergeant Major Nathaniel Garrison. He stood just under 6 feet tall, lean and weathered, like old leather left too long in harsh sun. His hair had gone completely white, cut military short. His face carried the map of everywhere he had been, lines etched deep around eyes that had seen too much and remembered all of it. He moved with a slight limp, favoring his left leg, but his posture remained ramrod straight. 67 years old, Cass learned later, though he moved like someone 20 years younger who simply chose to take his time. He wore faded jeans and a plain gray t-shirt that revealed forearms roped with muscle and decorated with scars that told stories he probably never shared. Holloway stepped forward, extending his hand. "Sergeant Major Garrison, welcome to FOB Blackwood." Garrison's handshake was firm and brief. "Captain, appreciate the hospitality. I know I'm an old man, taking up space better used for operational personnel." "You're hardly taking up space, Sergeant Major. Your reputation precedes you. We're honored to have you." Garrison's eyes shifted to Cass, studying her with the kind of assessment that felt simultaneously invasive and respectful. "This the medic you told me about?" Holloway nodded. "Specialist Cassandra Brennan. Best combat medic I've worked with in 15 years. She's got instincts you can't teach." Cass felt heat rise to her face at the unexpected praise. She extended her hand. "Pleasure to meet you, Sergeant Major." Garrison's grip was surprisingly gentle, his calloused palm rough against hers. "Brennan. Any relation to Robert Brennan, Desert Storm medic with the 3rd Armored?" Cass blinked in surprise. "That's my father. You knew him. Worked alongside his unit during the ground offensive. Your father saved my team leader's life when his Bradley took an RPG hit. Pulled him out of burning wreckage and treated him under fire. Good man, one of the best medics I ever saw operate." Something shifted in Cass's chest, hearing this stranger speak of her father with the kind of respect that transcended rank and time. "He doesn't talk much about Desert Storm, but he taught me everything I know about battlefield medicine." Garrison nodded slowly. "The good ones rarely talk about it. They just pass it forward." He turned to Holloway. "Captain, I requested this assignment specifically. Wanted to see how the new generation operates before I hang up my kit for good. I'm here to observe, maybe share some old lessons if they're still relevant. I won't interfere with your operations." Holloway gestured toward the aid station. "You're welcome to work alongside us, Sergeant Major. We'd be grateful for your experience. These mountains have a way of producing casualties that challenge even our best protocols." Over the following days, Garrison integrated himself into the rhythm of forward operating base Blackwood with the ease of someone who had done this dozens of times across multiple continents. He observed sick call procedures, reviewed supply inventories, and watched Cass and Sullivan treat the routine ailments that filled military medicine between moments of absolute chaos. He said little, but when he spoke, everyone listened. His comments carried the weight of 4 decades spent keeping soldiers alive in the worst places humanity could devise. He shared techniques for treating sucking chest wounds in desert heat. He demonstrated pressure point control for arterial bleeding that tourniquets couldn't address. He explained triage decision-making with the cold calculus of someone who had made those choices when there were too many dying men and too few medics. But more than technical knowledge, Garrison carried something else. An aura of absolute competence mixed with profound sadness, as if he had seen the best and worst of what humans could do to each other and found the experience simultaneously inspiring and devastating. Late one evening, Cass found him sitting outside the aid station, watching the sun paint the mountains in shades of copper and gold. She settled onto the sandbag wall beside him, maintaining respectful distance. "Permission to speak freely, Sergeant Major." Garrison smiled slightly. "We're not on parade ground, specialist. Speak your mind. Why are you really here? A man with your experience and rank could retire from anywhere. Why request deployment to a forward operating base in one of the most dangerous provinces in Afghanistan?" Garrison was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on distant peaks. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of things carefully considered. 26 years ago, I was a team sergeant in Somalia, Mogadishu. You probably learned about it in history classes if they still teach that particular disaster. Cass nodded. Battle of Mogadishu, October 1993, Black Hawk Down. That's the one. 18 American soldiers killed, 73 wounded. I was there for all of it. Special Forces team providing support to Rangers who got caught in a hornet's nest downtown. He paused, jaw working like he was chewing words too difficult to swallow. I made a choice that day, the wrong choice, and I've spent 26 years trying to make up for it. He didn't elaborate and Cass didn't push. Some wounds ran too deep for casual conversation, even between medics who understood the weight of impossible decisions. I came here because you remind me of someone, Garrison continued. The medic I should have been. You've got the instinct, the hands, the heart. You do this job the way it's supposed to be done, not the way fear makes us compromise. Cass felt the compliment settle uncomfortably on her shoulders. I just follow my training, Sergeant Major. Training gets you through the first crisis. After that, it's something else. Character, commitment, the absolute refusal to let soldiers die when you can prevent it. He turned to look at her directly. Your father had it. You have it. That's worth more than all the medals the Army can pin on your chest. The conversation stayed with Cass through the following days as September marched toward its conclusion. She watched Garrison interact with the younger soldiers, saw how they gravitated toward him despite his age and rank. He possessed the rare quality of making everyone around him feel simultaneously challenged and supported, pushed to excellence without being diminished by criticism. On September 14th, Cass marked the date in her journal with no sense of premonition, just another entry documenting the routine flow of deployment. She treated a soldier with a sprained ankle during sick call, helped Sullivan restock medical supplies, and reviewed trauma protocols with Captain Holloway. The base operated on constant alert status. 12-foot HESCO barriers surrounded the perimeter, topped with concertina wire that glinted viciously in the Afghan sun. Guard towers marked each corner, manned by soldiers scanning rocky terrain through thermal optics and night vision equipment. The mountains beyond offered countless hiding positions for enemy observers who watched American movements and planned their attacks with patient, methodical calculation. Cass had learned to read the rhythm of the base, morning helicopter flights bringing supplies and personnel, patrol rotations heading beyond the wire into hostile territory, the distant sound of controlled detonations as engineers cleared IEDs from roads, radio chatter providing constant updates on friendly force movements and potential threats. It created a strange normalcy, structured existence within the chaos of a war zone that had been running longer than some of the soldiers had been alive. The afternoon sun beat down with relentless intensity as Cass performed her daily equipment check, methodically reviewing the contents of her medical aid bag. Tourniquets in their quick access pouches, Israeli bandages for pressure dressing, chest seals for sucking chest wounds, hemostatic gauze for deep penetrating trauma, nasopharyngeal airways, decompression needles, pain medications measured in preloaded syringes. Each item represented hope measured in plastic, in fabric, in pharmaceuticals. Each had saved lives in her hands. Each might save more before this deployment ended. Sullivan looked up from cleaning a laryngoscope, his weathered face creasing with the beginnings of a smile. Quiet day. Cass shot him a look that carried universal military superstition. Don't jinx it, Doc. Garrison, sitting nearby reviewing supply manifests, chuckled quietly. In my experience, the quiet days are just the universe's way of making you think you're safe before it reminds you otherwise. Captain Holloway emerged from his small office, removing his reading glasses. Operations Center is tracking increased radio chatter in the surrounding valleys. Intelligence suggests possible enemy activity planning in the next 24 to 48 hours. I want all trauma bags fully stocked and ready for immediate deployment. Mass casualty protocols should be front of mind for everyone. The words carried no particular urgency, just professional preparation for possibilities that might never materialize. But they sent a small thrill of adrenaline through Cass's system, sharpening her focus, quickening her mental review of emergency procedures. Garrison stood moving to help organize supplies with the efficiency of someone who had done this thousands of times. The waiting is always worse than the actual event, he said quietly, speaking to no one in particular. Your mind creates scenarios more terrible than reality usually delivers. But when reality does deliver, you'll be grateful for every moment you spent preparing. The sun began its slow descent toward the western peaks as soldiers went about their evening routines. Infantry troops conducted weapons maintenance outside their barracks. Support personnel processed paperwork and organized equipment. Afghan National Army soldiers trained with their American advisors on the firing range beyond the perimeter, the crack of AK-47 fire echoing through the valley. Life continued with the structured predictability that defined military operations, thousands of small actions performed by hundreds of people, all contributing to the larger mission that most of them understood only in abstract terms. Private Tyler Mackenzie walked past the aid station, heading toward the chow hall. He was 19 years old, fresh-faced, and carrying the enthusiasm of someone on his first deployment who still believed in his own invulnerability. Cass had treated him 2 weeks earlier for a heat injury, taking extra time to ensure he understood proper hydration protocols in Afghanistan's brutal climate. He waved at her, grinning with youthful confidence. "Evening, Doc Brennan," Cass waved back, watching him continue toward dinner with the easy stride of someone who had never been truly hurt. She felt the familiar protective instinct that all medics develop toward their soldiers, the sense of responsibility that extended beyond medical care into something more personal and profound. Garrison noticed her watching. "You care about them." "They're my soldiers," Cass replied simply. "That's good. That's how it should be. But it also makes the hard moments harder." He paused, eyes distant with memory. "The ones you can't save stay with you longer than the ones you can. Remember that. Carry them, but don't let them break you." The warning felt oddly specific, carrying the weight of personal experience that Garrison clearly had no intention of elaborating on. Cass filed it away alongside all the other small lessons he had been sharing, building a mental library of wisdom earned through decades of blood and trauma and impossible choices. As darkness approached, Cass stepped outside one final time, breathing the cooling mountain air. The sky had transformed into deep purple, streaked with orange stars beginning to emerge in the east, where night had already claimed the sky. The mountains stood as black silhouettes against the fading light, beautiful and deadly, like everything else in Afghanistan. She thought about her father back in Detroit, wondered what he was doing at this moment. The time difference meant he was probably just starting his day, pouring coffee in the kitchen of the house where she had grown up. She had written him a letter the night before, filling pages with carefully edited stories that emphasized routine aspects of deployment while omitting the fear and danger that lurked in every mission beyond the wire. She hadn't mailed it yet. Some instinct made her hold on to it, as if sending it might somehow tempt fate. Garrison emerged from the aid station, moving to stand beside her in comfortable silence. They watched the last light fade from the western sky, two medics separated by 4 decades of experience, but united by the fundamental commitment to keep soldiers alive when everything conspired to kill them. "Whatever happens," Garrison said quietly, "remember that you've been trained by the best. Your father, your instructors, your own experience. Trust that training. Trust yourself. And remember that the medic creed isn't just words we memorize to pass a test. It's a promise we make about what we're willing to sacrifice to keep our brothers and sisters alive." Cass nodded, not fully understanding why Garrison chose this moment to share this particular wisdom. It felt like preparation for something specific, though she couldn't identify what. "I will never leave a fallen comrade," she recited quietly, the first line of the medic creed, that had been drilled into her consciousness at Fort Sam Houston. I will never leave a fallen comrade to fall into the hands of the enemy, and under no circumstances will I ever embarrass my country. Garrison smiled in the gathering darkness. That's the promise. Now comes the test of whether we mean it. The attack began at 1800 hours the following evening, just as the chow hall filled with soldiers grabbing dinner between shifts. Cass heard the distinctive whistle of incoming rockets, a split second before the first explosion rocked the base with enough force to rattle her teeth. Training and instinct took over immediately. She dropped to the ground, covering her head, as shrapnel whistled overhead and dirt rained down from the blast concussion. The base alarm system activated its piercing wail, cutting through the chaos of explosions and shouting voices. More rockets impacted across the compound, a coordinated barrage targeting barracks vehicle staging areas and the helicopter landing zone. The Taliban had positioned multiple launch points in the surrounding mountains, firing with practiced precision to maximize casualties and confusion. Cass scrambled to her feet and sprinted toward the aid station. Around her, soldiers rushed to defensive positions, grabbing weapons and body armor as they moved to repel the expected ground assault that typically followed rocket attacks. The guard towers opened fire with heavy machine guns, their tracer rounds streaking toward enemy positions in the darkening twilight. Captain Holloway and Garrison were already activating mass casualty protocols when Cass burst through the door. Holloway had transformed the aid station into a trauma center, laying out surgical instruments and preparing IV lines. Garrison moved with practiced efficiency, organizing trauma supplies and preparing for the wave of casualties that would arrive within minutes. Brennan Sullivan, grab your aid bags and additional trauma supplies. Holloway ordered, his voice calm, despite the continuing explosions outside. We're going to have casualties that need immediate treatment before they can be moved. Get ready to go where they fall. Cass slung her medical aid bag across her shoulder and grabbed a folding litter, the stretcher that would transport wounded soldiers back to the aid station. Sullivan did the same, both medics mentally reviewing trauma protocols as rockets continued to impact across the base. Garrison grabbed his own kit, decades-old muscle memory overriding retirement age. I'm going with them, Captain. Holloway started to object, then simply nodded. 3 medics were better than 2 when the casualties started mounting. The ground shook with each explosion, dust filtering down from the ceiling as the building absorbed shockwaves. The radio crackled with reports from across the compound. Guard towers reporting incoming small arms fire from the northwest. First platoon requesting ammunition resupply at the eastern perimeter. The operations center coordinating defensive responses and calling for helicopter evacuation support. Each transmission painted a picture of coordinated enemy action, a major assault designed to overwhelm base defenses and inflict maximum American casualties. A runner burst through the aid station door, a young specialist with wild eyes and blood splattered across his uniform. Doc, we got casualties at the vehicle staging area. Multiple wounded, some critical. Holloway pointed at Cass, Sullivan, and Garrison. Go, I'll coordinate from here and prepare for incoming. They ran into chaos, following the specialist through smoke and dust that obscured visibility to mere yards. Explosions continued to impact across the base, but Cass's focus narrowed to her immediate mission. Find the wounded, stop the bleeding, keep them alive. The vehicle staging area had taken a direct rocket hit. A Humvee burned with thick black smoke pouring from its destroyed engine compartment. Soldiers crouched behind vehicles, returning fire toward the perimeter, where Taliban fighters probed for weaknesses in the defensive line. Scattered across the open ground lay wounded men crying out for help, bleeding into the Afghan dirt. Cass spotted the first casualty immediately, a sergeant with shrapnel wounds across his legs and torso, bleeding heavily, but conscious and alert. She dropped to her knees beside him, her hands already reaching for trauma supplies before her conscious mind fully processed the injuries. I got you, Sergeant, Cass said, her voice projecting calm confidence she didn't entirely feel. Tell me where you're hurt. Legs, chest, everywhere. The sergeant gasped, pain evident in his clenched jaw. My guys. Check my guys first. But Cass was already performing rapid trauma assessment, her hands moving with practiced efficiency. Shrapnel wounds to both legs, one with the arterial bleeding that required immediate intervention. Minor wounds to chest and arms. Serious but treatable if she worked fast. She applied a tourniquet to the leg with the arterial bleeding, cranking the windlass tight until blood flow stopped. The sergeant groaned but didn't pull away, understanding that pain meant survival. Cass packed the chest wounds with hemostatic gauze, the specialized material designed to promote rapid clotting. She worked with focused intensity, blocking out the sounds of ongoing combat and explosions that continued to rock the base. Sullivan worked on another casualty 20 feet away, performing similar life-saving interventions. Garrison had disappeared into the smoke, moving toward other wounded soldiers with the determined stride of someone who had done this too many times to count. Cass stabilized her patient enough for transport and signaled for litter bearers. Two soldiers rushed forward, grabbed the wounded sergeant, and began moving him toward the aid station at a run. She was already scanning for the next casualty, her eyes cutting through smoke and dust to locate those who needed immediate help. That's when she saw Private Tyler McKenzie lying near the burned Humvee, motionless and alone. Everything else ceased to exist. Cass grabbed her aid bag and sprinted toward him, dodging debris and keeping low as enemies' small arms fire cracked overhead. Tyler lay on his back, his uniform torn and bloody, his face pale with shock. Cass dropped beside him and immediately began her assessment. Multiple shrapnel wounds across his abdomen and chest. Severe bleeding from his right thigh. Unconscious but breathing. His pulse rapid and thready beneath her fingers, the telltale signs of massive blood loss and impending shock. Her eyes locked onto the source of most critical bleeding. Arterial damage to the right femoral artery. The blood pumped in rhythmic spurts, bright red and catastrophic. Tyler had perhaps 5 minutes before blood loss became irreversible, before his brain and organs shut down from oxygen deprivation. Cass grabbed a tourniquet and positioned it high on Tyler's thigh, cranking the windlass with desperate strength. The bleeding slowed but didn't stop completely. Too much damage, too close to the torso for the tourniquet to be fully effective. She made an instant decision born of training and instinct. She pressed her hand directly into the wound, applying pressure to the damaged artery, feeling the pulsing blood against her palm. Her other hand reached for hemostatic gauze, packing it deep into the wound while maintaining pressure. Tyler moaned a sound that Cass welcomed because it meant he remained alive enough to feel pain. "Stay with me, Tyler," Cass said, her voice fierce with determination. "You're going to be fine. I've got you." The wound required constant pressure, both hands committed to keeping Tyler's blood inside his body where it belonged. She looked around for help, for litter bearers or other soldiers who could assist with moving her patient. What she saw instead made her blood freeze. 3 Taliban fighters had breached the perimeter, slipping through a gap in the defenses created by the concentrated rocket attack. They moved through the smoke and chaos with weapons raised, searching for targets of opportunity. And they were 30 feet away, closing on Cass's position with predatory focus. Her rifle hung across her back, unreachable, while both hands worked to keep Tyler alive. Her options narrowed to a single impossible choice: release pressure and grab her weapon, allowing Tyler to bleed out while she defended herself, or maintain pressure and hope the approaching enemy somehow didn't see them through the smoke and darkness. The choice wasn't really a choice at all. Cass had taken an oath, memorized the combat medic creed that defined her purpose and identity. "I will never leave a fallen comrade to fall into the hands of the enemy." The words went beyond poetry. They represented absolute commitment, a line that separated medics from every other soldier on the battlefield. She maintained pressure on Tyler's wound, her hands slick with his blood, her body positioned protectively over her patient. The Taliban fighters emerged from the smoke, their weapons sweeping across the staging area, their eyes locking onto Cass and her wounded soldier. Time seemed to compress and expand simultaneously, each second stretching into eternity while also racing past too fast to process fully. Cass saw the fighters raise their weapons. She saw the calculation in their eyes as they recognized an American medic vulnerable and exposed. She saw the moment they made their decision about how this encounter would end. The lead Taliban fighter, a man perhaps 30 years old with a dark beard and intense eyes that reflected professional military training, shouted something in Pashto, a command that Cass didn't understand but whose tone communicated clear intent. The other 2 fighters fanned out, taking flanking positions that gave them overlapping fields of fire. Standard small unit tactics executed with precision. Garrison's voice cut through the chaos from 40 feet away. "Cass, grab your weapon, I'll take him." Cass kept her hands pressed against Tyler's wound, her eyes meeting those of the lead fighter. "I've got him, Sergeant Major. I'm not letting go." The fighter approached slowly, his AK-47 raised and aimed at Cass's center mass. 10 feet separated them, then 8, then 5. Close enough for Cass to see the dust coating his clothing, the calculation in his expression as he assessed the situation, the slight surprise in his eyes when he realized she wasn't going to release her patient. He spoke again, gesturing with his weapon toward Tyler. The meaning transcended language barriers. Move away from the American soldier. Let him die. Save yourself. Cass shook her head, her hands maintaining steady pressure, despite the trembling that started in her core and threatened to spread to her extremities. Fear existed as a physical presence, tightening her chest and accelerating her heartbeat. But beneath the fear ran something stronger, a commitment that transcended self-preservation. "I'm not leaving him," Cass said, her voice steady despite everything. "You'll have to kill me first." The fighter's eyes narrowed, perhaps understanding her tone, if not her words. He took another step closer, now within arm's reach, his weapon still trained on Cass's chest. At this range, he couldn't miss. At this range, a single bullet would penetrate her body armor through sheer kinetic force, even if it didn't defeat the ceramic plates protecting her vital organs. Time balanced on a knife's edge, the moment stretching into something almost peaceful, despite its horror. Cass felt Tyler's pulse beneath her hands, felt his blood warm and slick between her fingers, felt the absolute certainty that she would maintain pressure on his wound until her own heart stopped beating. The fighter made his decision. Instead of pulling his AK-47's trigger, he slung the weapon across his back and drew a combat knife from his belt. The blade measured 8 inches long, curved and wicked, designed for close-quarters killing. The other two fighters moved closer, forming a loose circle around Cass and her patient. Cass understood immediately. They wouldn't shoot, wouldn't create noise that might draw attention from other American soldiers still engaged in fighting across the compound. They would use blades silent, impersonal, killing her, while she maintained her position over the wounded private who represented everything this war had become. The lead fighter lunged forward, his knife striking downward toward Cass's upper back. She felt the blade penetrate between her shoulder blades, felt the shocking coldness of steel sliding between ribs, felt her body's immediate rebellion against the violation. Pain exploded through her nervous system, white-hot and all-consuming. Cass gasped, but didn't scream, didn't cry out in a way that might reveal their position to nearby American soldiers. Her hands remained locked on Tyler's wound, pressure maintained even as her own blood began soaking through her uniform. The fighter withdrew the blade and struck again, this time aiming for her lower back. Another explosion of pain, another wound that sent shockwaves through Cass's system. Her vision blurred momentarily, gray edges creeping in from her peripheral vision as her body tried to shut down to escape the trauma being inflicted upon it. But Cass's training had prepared her for this in ways she had never consciously recognized. Pain management techniques learned during medical courses. Breathing exercises designed to maintain focus during high-stress situations. The fundamental understanding that her body would continue functioning long past the point where her mind believed survival possible. She kept her hands on Tyler's wound, kept pressure maintained, kept her patient alive. The second Taliban fighter joined the attack, his blade striking Cass's right side, cutting through uniform and body armor and flesh to reach vital organs beneath. She felt her right lung collapse, felt the sucking sensation as air entered her chest cavity. Through the knife wound, felt her breathing become labored and inefficient. Still, she maintained pressure on Tyler's femoral artery. Her hands remained locked in position, even as her own blood pooled beneath her knees, even as her body began the cascade of physiological responses that accompanied massive trauma. The third fighter struck her left leg, severing muscle and nerve bundles that sent electric jolts of agony up her spine. Cass felt her leg go numb below the knee, felt the disconnect between her brain's commands and her body's ability to respond. But the most devastating strike came in that second attack to her lower back. The blade penetrated deep, severing her spinal cord at the L1 vertebra. Cass felt something fundamental break inside her, a disconnection more profound than mere pain. Everything below her waist simply stopped. Cass's vision narrowed to a tunnel, the edges of her awareness collapsing inward. She could no longer feel her hands, though she could see them still pressed against Tyler's wound. She could no longer feel her legs, though she remained positioned protectively over her patient. Her body had become something separate from her consciousness, a collection of traumatized tissue that continued functioning through pure momentum, and the absolute refusal to accept that death could arrive before her mission was complete. Blood filled her collapsed right lung, making each breath a conscious act of will. Her heart rate accelerated, trying to compensate for the blood volume lost through multiple arterial wounds. Her blood pressure dropped, reducing oxygen delivery to her brain and vital organs. She was dying by medical textbook definition, her body shutting down system by system. But Tyler's wound remained packed. His arterial bleeding remained controlled. His life continued because Cass's hands stayed locked in position, even as her own life drained away into the Afghan dirt. The Taliban fighters stepped back and their mission accomplished. They had eliminated an American medic in the most brutal and personal way possible. They had sent a message about the cost of foreign intervention in their homeland. But they had also recognized something in Cass's absolute refusal to abandon her patient. Perhaps honor. Perhaps incomprehensible foreign madness. Perhaps something that transcended the political and ideological divisions that drove this endless war. Gunfire erupted from 40 feet away. Garrison, having finally reached another casualty and seen what was happening, dropped his patient and grabbed his rifle. 3 precise shots, 3 Taliban fighters down. He sprinted to Cass's position, his face twisted with anguish and rage. He found her collapsed over Tyler, still maintaining pressure on the femoral artery wound, unconscious, but her hands locked in position through muscle cramps turned to rigor from extended contraction. She held the line, Garrison whispered, tears streaming down his weathered face. God damn it, she held the line. Sullivan arrived moments later, taking in the scene with professional horror. He tried to pull Cass's hands away from Tyler's wound, but her muscles had locked completely. She won't let go, Sullivan said, his voice breaking. She's still treating him. Even now, she's still treating him. Captain Holloway's voice crackled through their radios. Get them both to me now. I've got surgical capability standing by. They lifted Cass, carefully preserving her position over Tyler, moving both casualties together toward the aid station. Garrison carried Cass himself, refusing to let anyone else touch her, his tears mixing with the blood that soaked his uniform. The battle continued to rage across Forward Operating Base Blackwood, but in that moment, carrying a medic who had made the choice, Garrison failed to make 26 years earlier. Nothing else existed except the desperate race to save a warrior who had proven the medic creed wasn't just words, but an absolute promise kept at ultimate cost. Cassandra Brennan existed in darkness for 3 days, her consciousness suspended in the liminal space between life and death, while surgeons at Bagram Airfield worked to save what remained of her shattered body. The initial surgery lasted 14 hours, a desperate race against hemorrhagic shock and multiple organ failure that left the trauma team exhausted and shaken. They had seen countless combat casualties flow through their operating rooms, bodies torn apart by IEDs and gunfire and rocket attacks. But something about this case hit differently. A medic stabbed 7 times while refusing to abandon her patient. A warrior who had chosen death over breaking her oath. Captain Marcus Holloway had accompanied Cass on the medevac helicopter from Forward Operating Base Blackwood, maintaining continuous pressure on her wounds during the 30-minute flight that represented her best chance for survival. He watched her vital signs deteriorate despite aggressive resuscitation efforts, saw her blood pressure drop to levels incompatible with life, performed emergency procedures mid-flight that bought precious minutes. Sergeant Major Nathaniel Garrison sat in the helicopter's web, seating his uniform still soaked with Cass's blood, his hands trembling with adrenaline, crash, and something deeper. He had killed the 3 Taliban fighters who attacked her, but the victory felt hollow and meaningless. He had arrived seconds too late to prevent the catastrophe, forced to watch another medic pay the price for following the creed he had abandoned 26 years earlier in Mogadishu. The trauma team cataloged the damage: multiple penetrating wounds to torso and extremities, collapsed lung, kidney and liver lacerations, fractured vertebrae. But most devastating was the L1 spinal cord transection, complete, irreversible, catastrophic. But the most devastating injury couldn't be repaired with surgery. The knife wound to her lower back had severed her spinal cord at the L1 vertebra, completely transecting the neural pathways that carried signals from her brain to her legs. The damage was catastrophic and irreversible, a permanent disconnection that meant Cassandra Brennan would never walk again. The surgical team leader, a colonel with 20 years of combat medicine experience, delivered the news to Holloway and Garrison in a small consultation room that smelled of disinfectant and despair. We saved her life, but we couldn't save her mobility. The spinal cord injury is complete. There's no surgical intervention that can repair that kind of damage. She'll have full function from the waist up, but everything below L1 is permanently paralyzed. Holloway closed his eyes, grief and admiration warring across his features. Private Mackenzie made a full recovery. He lost a lot of blood, but the medic's treatment saved his life. He's already been transferred to Landstuhl for continued care. He'll make a complete recovery and return to full duty. Garrison stood abruptly and walked out of the room without a word, his shoulders shaking with emotion he could no longer contain. He found an empty corridor and collapsed against the wall, sliding down to sit on the cold tile floor, while decades of accumulated guilt finally broke through the barriers he had constructed to contain it. Somalia. October 1993, the Battle of Mogadishu. He had been 35 years old, a Special Forces team sergeant, providing support to Army Rangers, who got caught in an urban ambush that turned into an 18-hour nightmare. He had faced the exact same choice Cass faced in Afghanistan. Enemy fighters closing in while he treated a Ranger with a sucking chest wound, both hands committed to sealing the wound and maintaining the soldier's airway. He had released his patient, grabbed his weapon, defended himself. The Ranger bled out in the 30 seconds it took Garrison to kill the approaching Somali militiaman. By the time he returned to his patient, the young soldier's eyes had already gone glassy with death, his last breath rattling out into the Mogadishu dust. Garrison survived. His patient didn't, and for 26 years he had carried the knowledge that he had chosen wrong, that he had violated the medic creed in the moment that mattered most. He had spent those 26 years trying to make amends, training hundreds of medics, deploying to every conflict zone where American soldiers needed medical support, teaching the creed with the fervor of someone trying to prevent others from making his mistake. But nothing had lifted the weight of that choice, the guilt that colored every subsequent moment of his career. Until Cass. She had faced his test and chosen differently. She had maintained pressure on Tyler Mackenzie's femoral artery while enemy fighters stabbed her 7 times. She had kept her promise even when keeping it cost her the ability to walk. She had done what Garrison couldn't do, and now she would pay for his failure and her courage for the rest of her life. Holloway found him 20 minutes later, still sitting in the corridor with his head in his hands. The captain settled beside him, maintaining the respectful silence of one warrior, keeping vigil with another. "It's not your fault, Sergeant Major." "Isn't it?" Garrison's voice came out raw and broken. "I told her to grab her weapon. I shouted at her to let me take Mackenzie. She refused because I taught her the creed means something. She believed me when I said it was a promise worth keeping, and now she's paralyzed because she had more courage than I did. She made her own choice, a choice that saved a life and upheld everything we claim to believe about being medics. That's not failure. That's the definition of success, even if the cost was terrible." Garrison lifted his head, his eyes red-rimmed and hollow. "I faced that exact situation in Mogadishu. Exact same scenario. Enemy closing and patient critical, both hands committed. I let my patient die to save myself. I've carried that guilt for 26 years, and now I've watched someone else pay the price I was afraid to pay." Understanding dawned across Holloway's face, the recognition of a wound that had never healed. "You're not responsible for her injuries, Sergeant Major. The Taliban fighters who stabbed her are responsible. The circumstances of war are responsible, but not you. I'm responsible for teaching her that the creed matters more than self-preservation. I spent 26 years trying to create the medic I should have been. And when I finally found one, I watched her sacrifice her legs to prove I was right." They sat in silence as the hospital continued its rhythmic operations around them. Medical personnel moving between wards. Wounded soldiers arriving from forward operating bases. The machinery of military medicine grinding forward with relentless efficiency. Cass woke on the 4th day, emerging from medically induced coma into a world of confusion and pain. Machines beeped rhythmic measurements of her vital signs. Tubes and lines connected her body to bags of fluid and medication. The sterile white ceiling of the intensive care unit stretched above her, harsh fluorescent lights, painful to eyes that had been closed for nearly 100 hours. A nurse noticed her stirring, immediately moving to Cass's bedside with practiced efficiency. "Welcome back, Specialist Brennan. You're at Bagram Airfield. You are safe. You were injured, but you're going to be okay." The words felt distant and meaningless. Cass tried to move, tried to sit up, tried to do anything except lie motionless in this bed surrounded by medical equipment. Her upper body responded sluggishly, weak but functional. Her legs didn't respond at all. No sensation, no movement, just nothing below her waist. Panic flooded through her system, triggering alarms on the cardiac monitor as her heart rate spiked. The nurse spoke in soothing tones while simultaneously pressing a call button that summoned additional medical staff. A doctor arrived within seconds, a major with kind eyes and the bearing of someone who delivered terrible news regularly. "Specialist Brennan, I'm Major Catherine Whitmore. I need you to stay calm while I explain your injuries." Cass tried to speak, but the breathing tube in her throat made vocalization impossible. Her eyes went wide with fear and confusion, her hands reaching up to touch the tube that violated her airway. "Don't fight the breathing tube," Major Whitmore said, her hand gentle on Cass's shoulder. "We'll remove it soon, but right now it's helping your damaged lung heal. I need you to blink once for yes, twice for no. Do you understand?" Cass blinked once, her medical training helping her navigate the terror of being unable to communicate. "Good. You were stabbed 7 times during combat operations at FOB Blackwood. You lost a significant amount of blood and sustained injuries to multiple organs. You've undergone extensive surgery and your prognosis for recovery from those injuries is very good. Do you understand so far?" One blink. "Yes." Major Whitmore's expression shifted, compassion and regret mixing in her eyes. "However, one of the knife wounds damaged your spinal cord. The injury resulted in complete paralysis below your waist. We've consulted with neurosurgery specialists, and I'm very sorry to tell you that the damage is permanent. You will not regain the ability to walk." Cass stared at her, the words penetrating through the morphine haze and post-operative confusion. Paralyzed. Permanent. Never walk again. The phrases repeated in her mind, each repetition driving the reality deeper into her consciousness. Her entire life had been defined by physical capability. Running 5 miles every morning since she was 16. Hiking mountain trails with her father during leave periods. Carrying wounded soldiers across battlefields under fire. Every memory, every plan for her future involved a body that functioned completely and responded to her commands without hesitation. That body no longer existed. That future had been severed as completely as her spinal cord cut away by a Taliban knife wielded by an enemy whose face she could barely remember through the fog of trauma and pain. Tears streamed down Cass's face, hot and bitter against her skin. Major Whitmore squeezed her shoulder gently, allowing her the space to process devastating news without platitudes or false reassurances. She had delivered this message before, had watched other soldiers grapple with life-altering injuries that redefined their entire existence. After several minutes, Cass managed to regain some composure. She blinked twice the signal for a question she couldn't yet articulate, but that Major Whitmore seemed to understand intuitively. "Private Tyler Mackenzie is alive and recovering at Landstuhl Regional Medical Center in Germany," the doctor said, answering the question Cass desperately needed answered. "He made a full recovery because of your actions. You saved his life, Specialist Brennan. Whatever else happens from here, that fact remains absolutely true." The information penetrated Cass's grief, creating a small, bright point in the darkness of her new reality. Tyler lived. Her patient survived. The mission she had accepted at the cost of her own mobility had succeeded. That knowledge didn't erase the devastation of her injuries, but it provided something to hold on to when everything else felt like it was slipping away. Over the following days, Cass was weaned from the ventilator and her breathing tube removed. Her voice returned, gradually rough and weak from disuse but functional. She began the difficult process of learning to live in a body that no longer responded as a complete unit, divided now into functional and non-functional territories, separated by an invisible line at her waist. Garrison visited every day, sitting beside her bed for hours, speaking little, but maintaining constant presence. The guilt that haunted him had transformed into something more complex, a mixture of pride and anguish that played across his weathered features every time he looked at her. On the 5th day, when Cass was strong enough for extended conversation, Garrison finally spoke the words he had been carrying. "I need to tell you something. About Mogadishu. About why I came to FOB Blackwood for my last deployment." Cass turned her head on the pillow to look at him, fully seeing the pain in his eyes. October 1993, Battle of Mogadishu, Somalia. I was a team sergeant with Special Forces supporting the Rangers who got caught downtown. His voice remained steady, but carried the weight of confession. We were pinned down, casualties everywhere. I was treating a Ranger with a sucking chest wound. 22-year-old kid from Oklahoma. Both my hands were sealing his chest, maintaining his airway. He paused, jaw working, as he prepared to speak words he had never said aloud to anyone. 4 Somali militiamen came through the smoke, maybe 20 feet away. My weapon was on my back. I had the same choice you had at FO Blackwood. The exact same scenario. Enemy closing in, patient critical. Both hands committed. Cass already knew how this story ended. She could see it in Garrison's eyes, in the decades of guilt that had carved lines into his face. I released him. I grabbed my weapon and I defended myself. Killed all 4 militiamen. But by the time I got back to my patient, he was gone. Bled out in the 30 seconds I spent saving my own life. His name was Private First Class Daniel Morrison, 22 years old. He died because I chose wrong. Tears ran freely down Garrison's face now, the armor of military bearing finally cracking under the weight of 26 years of accumulated guilt. I've spent 26 years trying to make up for that choice. Training medics, deploying to every war zone, teaching the creed like gospel, trying to create medics who would make the choice I couldn't make. And then I met you and I recognized someone who actually meant the oath. Someone who would keep the promise when it mattered most. His voice broke completely. I told you to grab your weapon. I shouted at you to let me take Mackenzie. But you refused. You held that line. You did what I couldn't do. And now you're paralyzed because you had more courage than I've ever possessed. Cass reached out with her hand, weak but steady, and gripped Garrison's weathered fingers. You taught me that the creed means something. That it's not just words we memorize to pass a test. You spent 26 years trying to create the medic you wish you'd been, and you succeeded. You created me. At what cost? Garrison whispered. You'll never walk again because I taught you to value a promise more than your own safety. I'll never walk again because 3 Taliban fighters stabbed me 7 times. That's on them, not you. And I'll never carry the guilt you've carried for 26 years. I made my choice knowing the cost. I'd make it again. Tyler Mackenzie is alive. That matters more than my legs. Garrison stared at her, seeing something in her eyes that he had been searching for since Mogadishu. Not forgiveness exactly, but absolution. Proof that the choice he should have made was possible, that following the creed completely wasn't just theoretical idealism, but achievable reality. You're the medic I should have been, he said quietly. I'm the medic you taught me to be. That's the real legacy. Not what you did in Mogadishu, but what you taught everyone after. You've saved more lives through your teaching than you could have saved with your own hands. Private Morrison's death wasn't meaningless. It created you, and you created me. That's the chain that matters. 2 weeks after waking from her coma, Cass received notification that she was being transferred to Walter Reed National Military Medical Center in Bethesda, Maryland. The facility specialized in treating catastrophically wounded service members with comprehensive programs designed to help them transition from intensive care to functional independence. The flight from Afghanistan to the United States took 36 hours with multiple stops for refueling and patient transfers. Cass traveled on a medical evacuation aircraft configured as a flying intensive care unit surrounded by other wounded warriors making the same journey from combat zones to definitive treatment. She watched America's coastline appear through the aircraft window, felt the complicated emotions of returning home under circumstances she had never imagined when she deployed 14 months earlier. She had left as a combat medic, confident in her abilities and purpose. She returned as a paralyzed veteran, facing an uncertain future measured in physical limitations rather than possibilities. Walter Reed National Military Medical Center occupied 113 acres in Bethesda, Maryland, its buildings housing some of the most advanced medical capabilities in the military healthcare system. Cass arrived on a gray October morning, the ambulance carrying her from Andrews Air Force Base, navigating through traffic that felt surreal after months of Afghanistan's sparse roads and military convoys. The spinal cord injury unit occupied the 4th floor of the main hospital building, a specialized ward where wounded warriors learn to navigate their new realities with the support of doctors, therapists, and fellow patients who understood challenges that civilians could barely comprehend. Garrison had pulled strings to ensure he arrived at Walter Reed before Cass taking medical retirement and relocating to the area specifically to be present for her recovery. He was there when her ambulance arrived, standing in the reception area with his weathered duffel bag and an expression of fierce determination. Cass's days fell into structured routines of physical therapy, occupational therapy, psychological counseling, and medical appointments. She learned to dress herself from a seated position, to transfer from wheelchair to bed, without assistance, to navigate bathrooms adapted for accessibility. Each small victory came with the acknowledgement of how much she had lost progress, measured against a baseline of complete dependence rather than her previous capabilities. The fourth week brought crisis that threatened everything. A severe kidney infection complication from one of the stab wounds that had damaged the organ. Her fever spiked to 104 degrees. Sepsis loomed as a deadly possibility, her body's inflammatory response threatening to cascade into multi-organ failure. Garrison refused to leave her bedside. He sat in the uncomfortable hospital chair for 72 hours straight, watching her thrash in delirium, speaking to her in steady tones about nothing and everything. He told her about his childhood in Montana, about his first deployment to the first Gulf War, about every lesson he had learned in 42 years of military service. He told her about Private Morrison, speaking the young soldier's name aloud, for the first time in decades honoring the memory by refusing to let it remain buried in shame and silence. Cass survived the infection, pulled back from the edge by aggressive antibiotics and the sheer stubborn refusal to let one more complication defeat her. But the setback devastated her mentally in ways the initial injury hadn't accomplished. The sixth week saw her hit bottom. She refused physical therapy for 5 consecutive days, lying in bed and staring at the ceiling with empty eyes. She pushed away visitors. She stopped eating anything beyond the minimum required to prevent feeding tubes. The future that had seemed difficult but achievable suddenly felt impossibly heavy, a burden too great to carry. The staff psychologist, Dr. Sarah Kim, tried multiple interventions: motivational discussions, cognitive behavioral therapy, medication adjustments. Nothing penetrated the wall Cass had constructed around her devastation. On the 5th day of refusal, Garrison wheeled himself into Cass's room. His left leg was in a cast from ankle to hip, the result of a fall he had taken 3 days earlier while carrying supplies to her floor. He had broken his leg in 2 places, but refused proper bed rest, insisting on maintaining his vigil over Cass's recovery. He positioned his wheelchair beside her bed and sat in silence for several minutes before speaking. I tried to kill myself twice after Mogadishu, once with pills, once with my service weapon. Both times someone found me before I finished the job. I spent 6 months in psychiatric treatment, convinced my life was over, that I had failed so completely, there was no point in continuing. Cass turned her head to look at him, seeing the vulnerability in his expression. You know what saved me? Another medic, a veteran triple amputee who worked as a counselor at the treatment center. He told me something I'm going to tell you now. Your story isn't over. Your war isn't over. It just changed battlefields. Tyler McKenzie is alive because you were stronger than me. Now be strong enough to rebuild. I can't walk, Cass said, her voice flat with despair. My career is over. Everything I trained for, everything I was good at, gone. What's the point? Garrison leaned forward, his eyes intense. The point is that you made a choice that defines who you are. You followed the creed when it cost you everything. That doesn't become meaningless just because the consequences are hard to live with. You saved a life. That life continues because of you. You think Tyler McKenzie's mother doesn't wake up every morning grateful you existed. You think the soldiers you'll inspire with your story don't matter. You think teaching the next generation of medics what courage really means isn't worth doing from a wheelchair. He grabbed her hand with surprising strength. I've watched you lie here for 5 days feeling sorry for yourself. I understand it. I lived it. But understand this, you don't get to waste the life you kept by refusing to live the life you have. That's not honoring your sacrifice. That's spitting on it. The harsh words cut through Cass's depression more effectively than gentle encouragement ever could. Garrison wasn't offering sympathy. He was offering truth delivered with the blunt force of someone who had walked this path and survived. I'm scared, Cass whispered. Good. Fear means you're alive enough to feel something. Let it drive you forward instead of pulling you down. The medic who held pressure on Tyler McKenzie while being stabbed 7 times doesn't quit because rehabilitation is hard. She adapts, she overcomes, she finds new ways to serve. Something shifted in Cass's chest, a small crack in the wall of despair that had been suffocating her. Garrison was right. She had survived the attack. They survived the surgery, survived the infection. Quitting now would make all of that suffering meaningless. The next morning, she returned to physical therapy with renewed determination. If she couldn't walk, she would become the strongest wheelchair user in the Army. If her legs didn't work, she would develop her upper body until she could transfer and maneuver with complete independence. The same intensity that had kept her hands locked on Tyler's wound now focused on reclaiming whatever autonomy remained possible. 8 weeks after arriving at Walter Reed, Cass received a visit from Colonel Jessica Hartwell, a 54-year-old career officer who specialized in awards and decorations investigations. She arrived with a thick folder of documentation and an expression that mixed professional efficiency with genuine respect. "Specialist Brennan, I'm here to discuss your Medal of Honor nomination." Cass blinked, certain she had misheard. "I'm sorry, ma'am. Did you say Medal of Honor? Your actions at Forward Operating Base Blackwood have been thoroughly documented and witnessed by 23 soldiers. You maintained treatment of Private McKenzie while under direct attack by enemy combatants, sustaining 7 stab wounds while refusing to abandon your patient. Your heroism directly saved Private McKenzie's life and exemplified the highest standards of military service." Cass struggled to process this information. The Medal of Honor represented the nation's highest military decoration, typically reserved for acts of valor that went beyond standard definitions of courage. She had simply done her job, executed her training, followed the medic creed she had memorized during her first days at Fort Sam Houston. "Ma'am, I appreciate the recognition, but I was just doing what any combat medic would do in that situation." Colonel Hartwell leaned forward, her expression serious. "Specialist 23 soldiers witnessed what happened in that staging area. 3 Taliban fighters had you at close range with weapons drawn. You could have released your patient, grabbed your own weapon, and defended yourself. Every regulation and rule of engagement would have supported that decision. Instead, you maintained treatment while being repeatedly stabbed, refusing to abandon Private McKenzie even when doing so would have saved your own life and prevented your catastrophic injuries." She paused, letting her words sink in. That choice, made consciously under direct threat, represents exactly the kind of selfless service the Medal of Honor was created to recognize. The Army doesn't award this decoration lightly. Your nomination has strong support from the chain of command, including powerful testimony from Sergeant Major Garrison. Garrison's testimony had apparently been extraordinary. He described watching Cass face the choice he had failed in Mogadishu, seeing her make the decision that had haunted him for 26 years. He spoke of her absolute refusal to abandon her patient despite knowing the likely cost. He called her the finest combat medic he had encountered in 4 decades of military service. "She's the medic I should have been," Garrison had written in his statement. "She upheld the medic creed in its purest and most heroic form. Every combat medic who hears her story will carry it with them, will remember what she did when they faced their own impossible choices." The Medal of Honor nomination process would take months to complete, requiring approval from Congress, and eventual presentation by the President of the United States. But Colonel Hartwell's visit made clear that the nomination had serious momentum, supported by overwhelming evidence and testimony from credible witnesses. 3 days before her scheduled discharge from inpatient rehabilitation, Cass experienced something that would stay with her longer than any official recognition. She was being wheeled outside for what she believed was a routine appointment transfer when she saw them. 32 Marines in dress blue uniforms, standing at attention in 2 parallel lines stretching from the hospital entrance to the circular driveway. Every one of them wearing their finest uniforms, white gloves, crisp eagle, globe and anchor insignia gleaming in the pale December sunlight. They had assembled at attention, waiting for Cassandra Brennan to pass between their ranks. A gunnery sergeant stepped forward, his bearing radiating the particular brand of professional competence Marines cultivated as cultural identity. His uniform displayed rows of ribbons indicating multiple combat deployments, his face weathered by years of service in harsh environments. Specialist Brennan, these Marines have assembled to thank you for saving one of our own. Private Tyler McKenzie was raised by Marines trained by Marines at Parris Island before his assignment to an Army unit for specialized joint operations. When you protected him with your own body, you protected our brother. We don't forget debts like that. He saluted sharply, holding the position with absolute precision. The corridor is yours, Specialist. Take your time. Cass gripped the wheels of her wheelchair and propelled herself forward under her own power, moving slowly between the lines of Marines. As she passed each pair, they executed crisp salutes, their movements synchronized with parade ground precision. 32 salutes rendered in perfect sequence, each one held until Cass moved beyond that position. The only sounds were wheelchair wheels on concrete and the subtle movements of Marines executing ceremonial protocol. Cass felt tears streaming down her face, no longer caring about maintaining military bearing or emotional control. This wasn't about regulations or proper procedure. This was about warriors honoring another warrior and acknowledging sacrifice that transcended service branches and unit assignments. Tyler McKenzie might wear an Army uniform, but his blood carried Marine Corps identity that these men and women recognized as binding obligation. They had assembled here to ensure Cass knew her sacrifice mattered to people beyond just Tyler, that her choice had rippled outward to touch communities she would never directly encounter. At the end of the corridor, Cass turned her wheelchair to face the assembled Marines. The gunnery sergeant called them to attention with a bark command that echoed off the hospital buildings. 32 Marines snapped to rigid position, their uniforms catching pale winter sunlight, their bearing reflecting pride in their service and respect for the Army medic who had protected one of their own. On behalf of the United States Marine Corps and every devil dog who has ever worn the uniform, we salute you, Specialist Cassandra Brennan. Semper Fi. The Marines saluted in unison, holding the position while Cass returned their salute one final time. The moment stretched into something beyond normal temporal experience, becoming memory even as it occurred, the kind of experience that would define how Cass understood her own story for decades to come. Garrison watched from nearby, tears streaming down his weathered face. He had never received such recognition, had never earned it. But watching Cass receive what she deserved felt like vicarious redemption proof that the medic he should have been actually existed, actually made the choice that mattered. After the Marines departed, Cass sat alone in her wheelchair outside the hospital entrance, watching winter clouds drift across the Maryland sky. She had joined the Army to serve, to use her medical skills, saving lives under the worst possible circumstances. That mission had succeeded beyond anything she imagined, earning recognition from warriors whose respect she valued more than any official medal. Her parents arrived that evening, having driven from Detroit to finalize discharge planning and discuss Cass's transition to outpatient status. Robert Brennan walked into his daughter's room with the measured composure of a man who had seen countless trauma patients during his decades as a combat medic. His eyes cataloged Cass's condition with professional assessment that couldn't quite disguise his emotional response. He had prepared his daughter for emergency medicine, had trained her in skills that ultimately saved Tyler McKenzie's life. But he had never imagined those skills would be employed under circumstances that cost Cass her ability to walk. The Marines came today, Cass said quietly, watching her father's face. 32 of them in dress blues, honor corridor for saving Tyler. Robert's jaw tightened, emotion flickering across his weathered features. You did what your grandfather did at Normandy, what I tried to do in Desert Storm. You upheld the family legacy, but God, I wish it hadn't cost you so much. Would you have made a different choice? Cass asked, needing to know. If you were me treating Tyler with enemy fighters closing in, would you have grabbed your weapon? Robert was silent for a long moment, clearly wrestling with the question. Finally, he shook his head. I don't know. I'd like to think I would have done what you did, but I've never faced that exact test. You did, and you proved that the medic creed isn't just something we memorize. It's who we are when everything else is stripped away. He gripped her hand, his calloused palm rough and familiar. I'm proud of you. Your grandfather would be proud. You saved a life at profound personal cost. That's the definition of heroism, even if the price feels impossibly steep. The recognition she needed most came not from the Marines or the Medal of Honor nomination, but from this moment with her father understanding that she had upheld a legacy 3 generations deep, that she had proven the values her family lived by weren't just abstract ideals, but achievable reality worth sacrificing for. The East Room of the White House gleamed with winter sunlight streaming through tall windows, illuminating rows of chairs arranged to face a small stage where the President of the United States would conduct a ceremony that occurred only a handful of times each year. January 28, 2020 had arrived with unseasonable warmth as if nature itself recognized the significance of what was about to transpire. Cassandra Brennan arrived early, her wheelchair navigating the accessible entrance, while Secret Service agents performed security screenings with professional efficiency. She wore her Army dress uniform, the green jacket and skirt tailored specifically for seated wear, her ribbons and badges gleaming against the dark fabric. The uniform felt strange after months of hospital clothes and rehabilitation gear, a connection to an identity that felt simultaneously familiar and impossibly distant. The front row held the people who mattered most. Her father, Robert Brennan, sat ramrod straight in his own dress uniform, the one he wore perhaps once a year for military ceremonies and funerals. At 62, he carried himself with the bearing of a career soldier, despite 2 decades of civilian life. His Bronze Star from Desert Storm was pinned alongside his other decorations, a visible reminder of the legacy Cass had upheld. Sergeant Major Nathaniel Garrison occupied the seat beside Robert, his dress uniform decorated with ribbons that told the story of 42 years spent in harm's way. His white hair was freshly cut, his weathered face cleanly shaved, but nothing could hide the emotion in his eyes as he watched Cass maneuver her wheelchair into position near the stage. Captain Marcus Holloway had flown from Afghanistan specifically for this ceremony, taking a brief leave from his duties at Forward Operating Base Blackwood. Corporal James Sullivan sat beside him, both medics wearing their dress uniforms with the quiet pride of men who understood exactly what Cass had sacrificed. And there was Tyler McKenzie. Private First Class Tyler McKenzie, now promoted in the months since the attack. He was 20 years old, healthy and whole. Every step he took a living testament to the price Cass had paid. He had written Cass dozens of letters during her recovery, each one expressing gratitude that words could never adequately capture. His presence here meant more than any official recognition, proof that her sacrifice had preserved a life that continued to matter. Other attendees filled the remaining seats. Department of Defense officials who administered the military awards system. Congressional representatives whose approval had been required for the Medal of Honor nomination. Senior military officers whose presence reflected the significance of this ceremony in American military culture. Journalists who would document this moment for historical record and evening news broadcasts. A protocol officer briefed Cass on the ceremony procedures, walking her through exactly what would happen and where she needed to position her wheelchair. The president would read a citation describing her actions at Forward Blackwood, then place the medal around her neck while photographers captured the moment for posterity. The entire ceremony would last approximately 30 minutes, followed by a reception where Cass would meet various officials and dignitaries. The president entered the East Room at precisely 1000 hours, his presence creating an immediate shift in the room's energy. He moved to the stage with practiced ease, his expression reflecting the appropriate gravity for a ceremony recognizing extraordinary valor and sacrifice. We gather today to honor Specialist Cassandra Brennan, United States Army, for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of her life above and beyond the call of duty. The president's voice carried easily through the assembled audience, each word weighted with the formality that such moments demanded. Her actions during combat operations in Afghanistan exemplify the highest traditions of military service and the profound commitment combat medics make to protect those under their care. He read the full citation, the official language describing the Taliban attack on Forward Operating Base, Blackwood Cass's treatment of Private Tyler McKenzie under fire, and her decision to maintain patient care while being stabbed 7 times by enemy combatants. The formal prose couldn't quite capture the visceral horror of that moment, but it preserved the essential truth. Cassandra Brennan had chosen another soldier's life over her own safety and paid an enormous price for that choice. Specialist Brennan sustained catastrophic injuries that left her permanently paralyzed from the waist down. The president continued, his eyes meeting Cass's with genuine respect. Yet even as enemy fighters attacked her with knives, she refused to release her patient, maintaining pressure on his wounds until other soldiers could reach them. Her absolute dedication saved Private McKenzie's life and represents the medic creed in its purest and most heroic form. The president stepped down from the stage and approached Cass's wheelchair, carrying the Medal of Honor in its presentation case. The medal itself was instantly recognizable, a design unchanged since the Civil War. A five-pointed star hanging from a light blue ribbon dotted with 13 white stars representing the original colonies. The physical object carried weight disproportionate to its size, representing the nation's highest recognition of military valor, earned through actions that transcended normal definitions of courage. On behalf of the United States Congress and the American people, I present you with the Medal of Honor, the president said carefully, placing the ribbon around Cass's neck so the medal rested against her dress uniform. Your sacrifice will never be forgotten. Your courage inspires all who wear our nation's uniform. The audience rose in standing ovation applause, filling the East Room for several minutes, while Cass sat in her wheelchair with the Medal of Honor around her neck, overwhelmed by recognition that felt simultaneously deserved and impossible to process. She had done her job, executed her training, followed the medic creed she had memorized during her first days of military service. That those actions warranted this level of recognition still felt surreal, like something happening to someone else that she was merely observing. The applause continued, waves of sound that seemed to physically press against her. Cass saw her father standing with tears streaming down his face, no attempt to hide his emotion. She saw Garrison standing with his hand over his heart, his expression mixing pride and pain in equal measure. She saw Tyler Mackenzie standing at attention, his face reflecting the weight of knowing someone had sacrificed her mobility so he could continue living. After the formal ceremony concluded, Cass moved through the reception with practiced efficiency, shaking hands with officials and accepting congratulations from people who wanted to connect with her story. The conversations blurred together familiar patterns of praise and questions about her injuries and plans for the future. She answered with responses she had developed over months of similar interactions, acknowledging their interest while maintaining emotional boundaries necessary for self-protection. Tyler approached during a brief lull in the social demands, his dress uniform marking him as active duty Army, despite his youth. He had grown in the months since F.O. Blackwood, his face carrying a maturity that hadn't been present before the attack. Near-death experiences had a way of accelerating the transition from boyhood to manhood, stripping away illusions about invulnerability. I'll never be able to thank you enough, Tyler said, his voice quiet amid the reception's ambient noise. Seeing you receive this medal, understanding what you sacrificed for me, it's overwhelming. Cass gripped his arm, needing him to understand that his survival provided meaning she desperately needed. You're alive, Tyler. You're building a life and career. That's the only thanks I need. Make it count. Make my sacrifice worth the cost by living well and serving honorably. I promise, Tyler replied, his expression reflecting the weight of obligation he carried. I've applied to become a combat medic. I want to follow your example, do what you did. You showed me what courage really means. I want to honor that. The words hit Cass with unexpected force. Tyler wasn't just surviving, he was transforming his survival into purpose, carrying forward the values she had demonstrated through action. The ripples of her choice extended beyond saving one life. They were creating new medics who understood what the creed demanded. Then make me proud, Cass said. Be the medic I taught you to value. Save lives. Keep the promise. That's how you honor what happened. The reception lasted 2 hours, a parade of handshakes and photographs and conversations that left Cass emotionally exhausted. Her father recognized her fatigue and expertly extracted her from the remaining social obligations, escorting her to the motorcade that would return them to their hotel. That evening, Cass sat alone in her hotel room with the Medal of Honor resting on the desk, its presence both validating and overwhelming. She had achieved recognition that most service members never received, joined an exclusive community of warriors whose courage had been acknowledged at the nation's highest level. But the medal couldn't restore her mobility, couldn't reverse the spinal cord damage that had changed her life permanently. She picked up the medal and, feeling its weight in her hands, reading the inscription that identified her name and the date of her heroic actions. This physical object represented abstract concepts like valor and sacrifice and selfless service. It connected her to generations of American warriors who had made similar choices, who had prioritized mission and comrades above personal safety. The medal provided something Cass hadn't realized she needed: external validation that her sacrifice mattered beyond just Tyler Mackenzie's survival. The nation recognized what she had done, acknowledged the cost she had paid, preserved her story for future generations who would study Medal of Honor recipients and find inspiration in their examples. That recognition couldn't fix her paralysis, but it provided framework for integrating her experience into coherent narrative. She wasn't just a paralyzed veteran struggling to adapt. She was a Medal of Honor recipient whose sacrifice embodied the highest ideals of military service. The distinction mattered psychologically, transformed her from victim of circumstance to active agent who had made conscious choices about values and priorities. 2 weeks after the White House ceremony, an envelope arrived at Cass's temporary apartment near Walter Reed. The return address listed no sender, only a postal route in Kabul, Afghanistan, forwarded through military channels and Red Cross intermediaries. The envelope had been inspected by security personnel, opened and resealed with official tape indicating it contained no threats. Inside was a single page of handwritten post in careful English, the letters formed with deliberate precision by someone for whom the language was clearly not native. The letter began simply, Specialist Brennan, AM Commander Hamid Azizi. I organized the attack on Forward Operating Base Blackwood on September 15, 2019. I watched through field glasses as my fighters engaged your soldiers. I watched as 3 of my men approached you while you treated your wounded comrade. Cass's hands trembled as she read, feeling violated by this communication from the enemy who had orchestrated the attack that destroyed her life. But she continued reading, compelled by the same instinct that made her unable to look away from accidents on the highway. I ordered my fighters to kill you. They had weapons and knives. You were defenseless, focused only on treating your patient. By all military logic, you should have released him and defended yourself. Any soldier would have made that choice. It is what we teach. It is what keeps warriors alive. The handwriting remained precise, each sentence carefully constructed. But you did not release him. You maintained treatment even as my fighters attacked with knives. I watched you refuse to abandon your duty even when that refusal meant death. 7 times they struck you. 7 times you remained focused on saving your comrade's life. Cass felt tears building behind her eyes, not understanding why this enemy's words affected her so deeply. In my culture, we have traditions about warriors and honor. We believe courage transcends the causes we fight for. We believe that those who face death without fear deserve respect even from enemies. What you did that day demonstrated courage that I have rarely witnessed in 40 years of war. The letter continued onto the back of the page. I am still your enemy. We fight for different causes. We believe different things about what is just in this world. But I wanted you to know that your courage was witnessed and recognized even by those who stood opposite you. You are a warrior. You have my respect, though we remain enemies. May God judge us both fairly for our choices in war. It was signed simply with a name and nothing more. No explanation of how he had obtained her address. No request for response. Just an acknowledgement from one warrior to another, crossing battle lines to recognize something that transcended the political and ideological divisions driving endless conflict. Cass sat with the letter for a long time, processing emotions she couldn't quite name. Violated that her enemy had reached out. Validated that even those who had tried to kill her recognized the magnitude of her choice. Confused about what it meant that courage could be respected by people trying to destroy each other. She showed the letter to Garrison during his next visit. He read it carefully, his expression thoughtful. In Somalia, after Mogadishu, one of the militia commanders sent a similar message through UN channels. Said the Rangers had fought with honor, that our dead deserve respect. It felt wrong at the time accepting recognition from people who had killed our soldiers. But years later, I understood. Warriors recognize warriors regardless of which side they fight on. It doesn't make the conflict right. It doesn't change what we believe. But it acknowledges shared humanity underneath the politics. Cass folded the letter carefully and placed it in a box with other meaningful items from her deployment. She would never respond to Commander Azizi, would never seek further communication. But she would keep the letter as a reminder that courage transcended sides, that the choice she made had rippled outward in ways she could never fully comprehend. March 2020 brought medical retirement from the Army, ending Cass's military career with full benefits and a disability rating that acknowledged the catastrophic nature of her injuries. She was 28 years old, a decorated combat veteran, facing a civilian future she hadn't planned or prepared for during the years when most people made those decisions. The transition felt disorienting, moving from military structure and clear purpose to the ambiguous freedom of civilian life. Cass relocated to a fully accessible apartment in Silver Spring, Maryland, close enough to Walter Reed for ongoing medical appointments, but separate from the military hospital environment that had defined her existence for 6 months. She struggled initially with basic aspects of independent living that able-bodied people took for granted. Grocery shopping required adaptive strategies and careful planning. Cooking from a wheelchair demanded kitchen modifications and new techniques. Transportation meant navigating public transit systems designed primarily for ambulatory passengers, constantly encountering barriers both physical and social that marked her as different from the mainstream population. But Cass attacked civilian adaptation with the same intensity she had brought to military service and rehabilitation. She joined adaptive sports programs, discovering wheelchair basketball provided both exercise and community. She connected with other paralyzed veterans through support groups, building networks of people who understood her specific challenges without needing extensive explanation. The COVID-19 pandemic complicated her transition, creating isolation that amplified the difficulties of adapting to her new life. But it also provided unexpected opportunities for reflection and skill development. Cass enrolled in online courses through the University of Maryland, beginning work toward a bachelor's degree in public health with focus on veterans issues and disability advocacy. She discovered she had things to say about the military medical system, about how the Department of Veterans Affairs treated catastrophically wounded service members, about societal attitudes toward disability that created unnecessary barriers for people whose bodies function differently than arbitrary standards defined as normal. Her Medal of Honor provided platform that amplified her voice, opened doors that remained closed to veterans without similar recognition. Journalists wanted her perspective on military medicine. Advocacy organizations invited her to speak at conferences. Congressional staffers sought her input on veterans' healthcare legislation. Cass learned to navigate this new role carefully, understanding that her words carried weight disproportionate to her experience because of the medal around her neck in official photographs. She chose her battles strategically, focusing on issues where her direct experience provided genuine insight, while avoiding topics where she possessed no special expertise beyond celebrity status. In October 2020, Cass accepted a position at Walter Reed National Military Medical Center as a patient advocate and peer counselor for newly wounded warriors arriving from combat zones. The job brought her back to the facility where she had learned to navigate her own paralysis, but now in a role supporting others through similar transitions. Her days involved meeting with newly injured service members, sharing her story, providing practical advice about adapting to catastrophic injuries while maintaining hope for meaningful futures. She understood their fears and frustrations in ways able-bodied counselors couldn't, had lived through the darkest moments of questioning whether life as a paralyzed person held any value or purpose. The first months are the hardest. Cass told a young Marine who had lost both legs to an IED in Syria, "You'll question everything, wonder if your life is still worth living, feel like a burden to everyone around you. Those feelings are normal and valid, but they're not permanent. You'll adapt, discover new capabilities, and eventually build a life that feels meaningful again." She showed him her Medal of Honor not to boast, but to demonstrate that catastrophic injury didn't preclude recognition and achievement. "I received this after I was paralyzed. My career didn't end when I lost my mobility. It changed direction, but meaningful service remained possible. The same will be true for you." Tyler McKenzie visited Cass regularly, their connection having evolved into genuine friendship built on mutual respect and shared understanding of that night at FOB Blackwood. He had completed combat medic training, graduating top of his class, and now worked at Walter Reed, gaining experience before his next deployment. "I tell the patients about you," Tyler shared during one visit. "Not just the heroic stuff, but the full story. How you adapted after your injuries, built a meaningful career, continued serving even after losing your mobility. They need to understand that courage isn't just battlefield action. It's also how you face adversity and keep moving forward when everything feels impossible." Cass appreciated that Tyler shared the complex reality of her experience, rather than sanitizing it into simple inspiration narrative. Her life as a paralyzed veteran involved daily challenges, ongoing medical issues, and psychological struggles that would never completely resolve. But it also involved genuine satisfaction, meaningful work relationships that mattered, and the knowledge that her sacrifice had preserved a life that was now touching others through Tyler's service and teaching. In December 2024, 5 years after her catastrophic injuries, Cass received notification that changed everything. The Army Medical Department planned to name a new combat medic training facility in her honor. The Brennan Center for Combat Medicine would open at Fort Sam Houston in 2026, providing state-of-the-art training for thousands of medics who would deploy to future conflicts. The honor moved Cass deeply, representing permanent recognition that would outlast her own life and carry her story to medics she would never meet. Her name would be spoken by drill sergeants and instructors for decades to come. Her example used to illustrate the medic creed's practical application. Her choices studied by future generations facing their own impossible decisions. Cass attended the groundbreaking ceremony in March 2025, watching construction equipment begin excavation for the building that would bear her name. She thought about the young medic she had been when training at Fort Sam Houston 7 years earlier, confident and unprepared and determined to serve. She thought about the choices that medic would make years later on an Afghan battlefield, choices that would define her life and inspire others. The circular completion felt appropriate. Her military career beginning and ending at the same facility. Her story preserved in concrete and steel that would train medics for decades to come. Garrison stood beside her at the construction site, now 71 years old and moving carefully with a cane that supported his aging frame. He had been diagnosed with early-stage heart disease 6 months earlier, his body finally beginning to fail after 7 decades of hard use. But he had insisted on attending this ceremony, refusing to miss the moment when Cass's legacy became literally built into the foundation of military medicine. "Your grandfather saved 47 men at Normandy," Garrison said quietly, watching the excavation equipment work. "Your father saved countless soldiers in Desert Storm. You saved one man in Afghanistan, and in doing so, you saved every future medic from doubting what the creed means. This family's legacy is complete." Tyler McKenzie stood on Cass's other side, now 25 years old, and a qualified combat medic preparing for deployment to Syria. He had grown into the role she had inspired him to pursue, carrying forward the values she had demonstrated through action rather than words. "I'll be training here in 6 months, Tyler said, gesturing at the construction site. "Learning advanced trauma procedures in the building named after you. That means something. That continues what you started." Cass felt tears building, but didn't try to stop them. This moment deserved emotion, deserved acknowledgement of how far she had traveled from that staging area at FO Blackwood, where Taliban fighters had stabbed her 7 times while she refused to abandon her patient. She had joined the Army to serve, to use her medical skills, saving lives under the worst possible circumstances. That mission had succeeded beyond anything she imagined, earning recognition that transcended individual achievement to become lasting legacy. But the cost had been impossibly steep, measured in severed spinal cords and wheelchairs, in a future that bore no resemblance to any plan she had ever made. "Art Martinez once told me that warriors carry their battles forward," Garrison said, referencing a quote Cass didn't recognize. "That service continues long after combat ends. You've proven that truth. Your war didn't end at FOB Blackwood. It just changed form. You're fighting different battles now, but they matter just as much as anything you did in Afghanistan." 1 month later, Garrison passed away peacefully at his home in Montana. A heart attack in the early morning hours, quick and merciful ending, 71 years of life that had been defined by service and sacrifice, and the burden of one choice made in Mogadishu that had haunted him for 26 years. Cass delivered the eulogy at his funeral at Arlington National Cemetery, wheeling herself to the podium with the same determination she brought to everything else. Hundreds attended, warriors from multiple generations who had served alongside Garrison or been trained by him, all gathered to honor a medic who had spent decades trying to atone for a single moment of human weakness. Sergeant Major Garrison carried guilt for 26 years. Cass said, her voice steady despite tears streaming down her face. He faced a choice in Mogadishu that no one should ever have to make. He chose to save himself instead of his patient. That choice haunted him every day for the rest of his life. He spent those 26 years trying to create medics who would make the choice he couldn't make. She paused, looking out at the assembled mourners. He succeeded. He taught me that the medic creed means something, that it's not just words we memorize to pass a test, but a promise we make, about what we're willing to sacrifice. I made that choice in Afghanistan because he taught me it was possible. It cost me my legs, but it freed him from 26 years of guilt. We saved each other. The words hung in the cold April air, truth that transcended simple eulogy. Garrison and Cass had been bound together by choices made decades and continents apart, two medics who had faced the same test with different outcomes, but united purpose. After the funeral, Cass wheeled herself to Garrison's grave, placing his Desert Storm medic bag on the fresh earth. The bag had traveled with him through 5 wars, carried supplies that saved countless lives, represented everything he believed about service and sacrifice. "Mission complete, Sergeant Major," Cass whispered. "You can rest now. I'll carry it forward from here." 6 months later, Tyler deployed to Syria as a combat medic with the 82nd Airborne Division. He wrote Cass regularly letters describing his work treating casualties and training Syrian partners. His words carried echoes of everything she and Garrison had taught him, proof that their legacy lived on in new hands. "I carry your legacy and Garrison's wisdom," Tyler wrote in one letter. "The medic creed lives on. Yesterday I treated 3 wounded soldiers under fire. I thought about you maintaining pressure on my femoral artery while being stabbed. I thought about Garrison teaching us that the promise matters more than self-preservation. I kept treating them even when it would have been safer to take cover. They all survived. Thank you for showing me what courage really means." Cass read the letter multiple times, feeling the weight and satisfaction of purpose achieved. She had saved Tyler's life at Fort B. Blackwood. Now Tyler was saving other lives, carrying forward the values she had demonstrated. The ripples continued outward, touching people she would never meet, changing outcomes in ways she could never fully measure. She sat in her apartment that evening, watching sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. The Medal of Honor hung in a shadow box on the wall beside her grandfather's Distinguished Service Cross and her father's Bronze Star. 3 generations of combat medics, 3 generations of sacrifice, 3 generations of choosing duty over safety. Cass thought about the young woman who had stood outside the aid station at Fort Blackwood, but holding a cup of cold coffee, unaware that her life would change within hours. She thought about the impossible choice that had cost her mobility and earned her recognition. She thought about Garrison finding redemption. She thought about Tyler carrying forward their legacy. The price had been steep, measured in paralysis and pain and daily struggles that would never completely end. But the meaning was undeniable, built into training facilities that would teach thousands of future medics, written into citations and letters and stories that would be told long after she was gone. Cass had made her choice knowing the cost. She had followed the medic creed to its absolute conclusion. She had saved a life and inspired others and proven that the promise meant something more than poetry. That knowledge, hard-won and blood-purchased, sustained her as she faced whatever came next. The legacy was secure. The mission was complete. The promise had been kept. And in the end, that was all that mattered.